Okay, I'm going to start the show by saying that this is, of course, speculation. This is just a theory, not even a theory. It's a hypothesis of something that could happen. But there's been a couple of questions that have been rolling around in my head as I've been watching the Russian conflict over the last year or so. And with the knowledge that the US is losing its position as the global hegemon and that China is its real counterpart, then I thought about this. What if the US wanted to defeat China, but they knew that they couldn't do it? And they knew that they couldn't do it because China is too far away for the US geographically. All the wargaming has been done by the Pentagon, and it's too far for the US to take the fight to the Chinese. The Chinese have got submarines now, the US have got submarines. All the war games come out badly when they consider, say, a conflict or a fight over Taiwan. An actual US invasion of China to try to overtake China and beat China, it's just too far away. It's too hard. So the US can't take the fight to China in the traditional way. So what if it planned to do it by proxy? Who would it use? So it couldn't use Germany and Poland. They're too far away. It would be difficult to engineer a conflict between Germany and Poland and China. They would have to fight their way through Russia, which wouldn't work anyhow. That would involve a NATO Article 5 thing being invoked, and that could be a problem for the West. They couldn't use Japan or Korea. They're too small. You know, they're both militarily capable, but they're really smaller appendages of the US in terms of the military, too small to take on China. But the US could use Russia. Russia is right next door to China. And Russia, as we've seen in the conflict with Ukraine, if it were to feel existentially threatened, it will fight a hard war. So Russia could be used as a proxy by the US to fight China, in just the same way that Ukraine has been used as a proxy to fight Russia. The US could use Russia against China. Now, if you wanted to do this, if you wanted Russia to fight China on your behalf, you wouldn't want the Russia of 2 years ago. You wouldn't want a weak Russia. You would want a militarily strong, proven, tested Russia to fight China. A Russia that could land a real big punch on China if it came down to it. So how do you do that? How do you take the Russia of 2 years ago and make it really strong? By engaging it in this conflict with Ukraine. If we take off a lot of the Western media blinders and look at what has actually happened to Russia because of the sanctions, because of the Russian domestic investment within the country, because of the existential threat that Russia has felt, it has moved itself to a proper war footing. And Russia has grown in military strength. It is today well beyond and far stronger than it was 2 years ago. So if you add in the continued threat of perhaps a NATO war with Russia, which we've heard Russian President Putin speak of, we've heard Russian President Macron talk about the possibility of a NATO war going on for years with Russia, that is your lever to get Russia to gear up over a number of years to grow its military strength. So if you do that and then you wait until just the right time and then engineer a conflict between Russia and China, then suddenly you're in a position whether if you're the US, where you now are able to inflict damage upon China using an adversary but who is strong in Russia against the Chinese military. So, now remember, I said this is speculation. I'm not saying this scenario is correct in all respects, but it does answer some questions. You know, why has the US not provided, say, its latest weapons to Ukraine. There's been this constant cry from the Ukrainians that we could beat the Russians if we had more weapons, if we had your latest and best weapons and more of them. You know, if we had Abrams. Ukraine has got 10 Abrams in the country. Why hasn't the US given them modern Abrams tanks? Why hasn't the US given them F-16s? Why hasn't the US given them F-22s and F-35s? Why hasn't the US positioned its missile-carrying subs in the Black Sea and aircraft carriers on the top north of the Mediterranean and really helped out in the fight? Why hasn't an engineered event occurred to allow a NATO Article 5 event to be invoked and NATO join Ukraine and actually beat Russia? And I think it's because the US never wanted to beat Russia. They don't want the Russians annihilated and wiped off the map. They want the Russians strong, really strong, because the US know that China is the real peer competitor and they need a plan to beat them. And if they can't beat them themselves in an outright fight because of the geographic distance and the numbers, maybe they can beat them if they slowly use up European nations to fight against them. So, as Russia is talking about becoming a superpower again, maybe a few more years to allow Russia to grow in strength, ready for a big fight. Perhaps even a rapprochement between Europe and NATO and Russia after a few years, just to make what's coming a little bit easier, to allow the NATO nations to actually get in and join and support Russia if Russia is going to front a conflict with China. A few years of destabilizing the growing Chinese-Russian relationship. Now, the US have been meddling in other nations' affairs, engineering coups and wars for years, so it's entirely plausible that the US could be upon a path of destabilizing that relationship, engineering an event, could even be a US false flag event, some engineered attack from within Russia upon China, or vice versa, to kick off a conflict there. Then the US can just sit back and watch its two biggest competitors fight it out and weaken one another. Now, depending on how that might be engineered after a year or two and Russia becoming weakened in that conflict, you might then, as I say, introduce the other NATO nations at that stage. And you spend a few more years using up Polish soldiers and German soldiers and Romanian soldiers and what have you, fighting against the Chinese. Until 10 years down the track, the US, still untouched where it is in the Northern Pacific and the Northern Atlantic, China and Russia having fought themselves to who knows to what level of weakness or destruction, and the US regains its position as the single global hegemon. Now, if that happens, there's no need to fight over Taiwan. The US could just go in and take Taiwan. And I can't believe that someone in the US isn't taking a long-term strategic view at this. The US recognise that right now they are losing their position as a single global hegemon, and they don't want to lose that position. Now, this short-term fight, which is Ukraine fighting Russia, which is making the US look bad, and in some ways it is in comparison to Russia's growth, but this could be part of a longer plan. Keep that fight going for a couple of years, keep Russia growing, let Europe and Ukraine do that, use them up to let Russia grow, give that time for the US and the other NATO nations to then themselves turn on their military industrial complex, restart those factories and the weapons production, start the rhetoric that China and Russia are going to be a threat against NATO. So NATO starts to feel, when I say NATO, the European nations start to feel that real existential threat, and they start to gear up for war, and then point them all through an engineered event at China and let them fight that out in that part of the world. Now, if this is the case, then this puts into perspective, or a possible frame, that the Ukraine war is just preparation. It's just a test. It's a trial run for a proper proxy war with Russia fighting on the US's behalf against China. What do you think? Hey, thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed and you enjoy the channel, please subscribe. I look forward to talking to you again soon.